What does it take to hold when everything tells you to break? When you're surrounded by an enemy that outnumbers you 4-1, when your ammunition is running low and your medical supplies are exhausted, when the temperature drops below zero and you haven't eaten a hot meal in days, when the wounded are dying because there's no way to evacuate them and the dead are piling up because the ground is too frozen to dig graves, what keeps you fighting? Is it duty, or is it something more primal, the refusal to surrender to men trying to kill you? Can humans endure more than they think possible when they have no choice, when the only options are to hold or die? I know the answers to these questions because I lived them during 8 days in December 1944, when I was part of the 101st Airborne Division, defending the Belgian town of Bastogne against the full weight of the German winter offensive. Those 8 days felt like 8 years, compressed time where every hour brought new horrors and new tests of human endurance. This is my story of the siege, of holding when holding seemed impossible, of discovering that the human spirit can endure almost anything when there's no alternative. My name is Joseph Paul Martinez, and I was a 23-year-old staff sergeant in the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the legendary 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. We jumped into Normandy on D-Day, fought through France, jumped again in Holland during Market Garden, and by December 1944 we were resting and refitting in camps near Reims, France. We'd been through hell multiple times, had taken heavy casualties, and we desperately needed the rest. The new replacements needed training, the veterans needed recovery, and everyone needed time away from combat. We thought we'd have weeks, maybe months, before being committed to battle again. We were wrong. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, punching a huge hole in the American lines and threatening to split the Allied forces. The offensive caught everyone by surprise. Our intelligence had completely missed the buildup, and suddenly divisions of German armor and infantry were pouring through a thinly defended sector and driving toward the Meuse River. If they reached the river, if they could cross it, the entire Allied position in Europe would be threatened. The key to stopping the offensive was a small Belgian town called Bastogne, a road hub where 7 major roads converged. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the entire region. The Germans needed it to sustain their offensive. The Allies needed it to prevent a breakthrough, and the 101st Airborne Division was ordered to get there first and hold it at all costs. We loaded onto trucks on December 18th with almost no preparation, no winter clothing beyond what we'd been wearing in camp, no clear understanding of what we were driving into. The trip took most of the day, and as we got closer to Bastogne, we started seeing signs of the disaster that had befallen the front. Refugees streaming west, American units retreating in disorder, destroyed equipment, and the general chaos of a collapsing front. We arrived in Bastogne on the evening of December 18th and immediately began establishing defensive positions around the town. The situation was confused. Nobody knew exactly where the Germans were or how strong they were, but we knew they were coming and that we had to be ready. My company was assigned to defend the southeast sector, facing the direction the main German advance was expected to come from. We dug in as best we could in the frozen ground, established machine gun positions, laid mines, prepared obstacles, did everything we could with the few hours we had before the Germans arrived. The ground was frozen solid, making digging brutally difficult, and we didn't have proper cold weather gear. Most of us were wearing the same uniforms we'd been wearing in the relatively mild weather of France, with maybe an extra sweater or jacket scrounged from somewhere. Nobody had winter boots, nobody had proper gloves, nobody had the insulated clothing designed for sub-zero temperatures. We were going to fight a winter battle dressed for autumn, and that inadequacy would cost us almost as many casualties as German fire. The Germans arrived on December 19th, probing our positions, testing our strength, preparing for the main assault. We could see their armor in the distance, could hear their vehicles moving into position, could see the sheer size of the force arrayed against us. They had tanks, artillery, fresh troops, everything they needed to overwhelm our position. We had rifles, machine guns, some mortars, and determination. It should have been a mismatch, should have resulted in our rapid defeat and the German capture of Bastogne. But we were paratroopers, trained to fight surrounded, trained to hold impossible positions, and we'd been through too much to quit now. The first major German attack came on December 20th, hitting our sector with tanks and infantry, trying to break through to the town. We stopped them barely with a combination of rifle fire, mortars, and sheer refusal to break. The fighting was close and brutal, Germans getting within grenade range before being pushed back, our positions almost being overrun several times. We took casualties, men killed and wounded, and we had no way to evacuate the wounded because the town was now completely surrounded. The medics did what they could, but without proper facilities or supplies, many men who might have survived with proper treatment died in makeshift aid stations. By December 21st, we were completely encircled, cut off from all supply and reinforcement. The Germans had closed the ring around Bastogne, and we were trapped with about 15,000 American troops against a German force estimated at 50,000 or more. We had limited ammunition, limited food, limited medical supplies, and no way to get more. The weather had turned terrible, heavy clouds and fog that prevented air supply or support. We were on our own, holding a town we couldn't abandon against an enemy that wanted it badly enough to throw everything they had at us. That's when General McAuliffe, our division commander, received the famous German surrender demand. German officers came under a white flag and delivered a written ultimatum: surrender Bastogne or face annihilation. They gave us 2 hours to decide. McAuliffe's response became legendary. Nuts. When the German officers asked what it meant, the American officer translating told them, "It means go to hell." That response, that absolute refusal to even consider surrender, crystallized what we all felt. We weren't giving up Bastogne. We'd hold until we were relieved or until we were all dead. There was no middle ground. The German response to our refusal was predictable. They intensified their attacks, hit us from multiple directions simultaneously, tried to crush us through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. My sector was attacked constantly, sometimes multiple times in a single day, always by forces that outnumbered us significantly. We fought from our frozen foxholes, fired until our rifles were too hot to touch despite the cold, threw grenades until we ran out, and when ammunition got critically low, we stripped it from the dead, both American and German. The fighting was so intense that time became meaningless, one day bleeding into the next without clear demarcation, just an endless cycle of attack and defense, of killing and being killed. The cold was as dangerous as the Germans, maybe more so. The temperature dropped to near 0 Fahrenheit, with wind chill making it feel even colder. We had no way to build fires during the day because the smoke would draw artillery, so we froze in our foxholes, trying to stay alert despite the cold sapping our energy and our will. Men developed frostbite by the hundreds, losing toes and fingers and feet to the cold. Some simply froze to death in their positions, fell asleep on watch and never woke up. Victims of exposure rather than enemy action. We tried to help each other, shared body heat, traded positions so that no one stayed motionless too long, did everything we could to fight the cold as well as the Germans. But it was a losing battle. The cold was relentless, and we had no defense against it except endurance. Food became critically scarce by December 23rd. We were on half rations, then quarter rations, then eating whatever we could scavenge. I remember eating snow to fill my stomach, mixing it with sugar from K-ration packets to give it some taste, pretending it was food even though it did nothing to stop the hunger. Some men were so desperate they ate bark from trees, or grass they dug out from under the snow, or anything that might provide calories. The lack of food combined with the cold and the constant stress of combat created a state of exhaustion beyond anything I'd experienced. We were walking dead men, functioning on adrenaline and stubbornness, unable to think clearly but still able to fight because that's all we knew how to do. The wounded suffered most. Our aid stations were overwhelmed, surgeons working by candlelight in cellars, trying to save men with inadequate supplies and no way to evacuate the seriously wounded. Men with wounds that would be survivable in a rear area hospital died in Bastogne because we couldn't give them the care they needed. I watched a friend, Private Eddie Thompson from Texas, die from an abdominal wound that any surgeon in a proper hospital could have treated. But our surgeon had no blood for transfusions, no antibiotics, no proper anesthesia. Nothing except morphine to ease the pain while Eddie slowly bled to death internally. He took 3 days to die, 3 days of agony and slow failure, and there was nothing any of us could do except sit with him and lie about how he was going to be fine. His death haunts me still, the senselessness of it, dying not from the wound itself but from lack of treatment, dying because we were surrounded and cut off and unable to get him help. Christmas Eve of 1944 was the coldest, most miserable night of my life. The Germans launched major attacks all around the perimeter, trying to break through before American reinforcements could arrive. My sector was hit by tanks and infantry, a coordinated assault that very nearly succeeded in breaking our line. We were down to maybe 10 rounds per rifle, had expended almost all our grenades, were fighting with captured German weapons because our own were empty. The fighting went on for hours, hand-to-hand combat in some places, American and German soldiers struggling in the snow and darkness, killing each other with knives and fists and rocks when ammunition ran out. We held barely, pushing the Germans back through sheer determination. But the cost was terrible. Half my company was casualties, dead or wounded, and the survivors were barely functional from exhaustion and cold and hunger. That night, Christmas Eve, sitting in my frozen foxhole, I hit my lowest point. I was sure I was going to die in Bastogne, certain that we couldn't hold much longer, that the next attack or the one after that would be the one that broke us. I thought about my family in New Mexico, about the warm Christmas they were probably having, completely unaware that I was freezing to death in Belgium. I thought about all the things I'd never get to do, never get married, never have children, never see home again. I thought about just giving up, just surrendering or walking away or doing anything except continue to endure the impossible. But I didn't give up, couldn't give up, because the men around me were enduring the same misery and they weren't quitting. And I couldn't be the one who broke when everyone else was holding. That's what kept us going. Not grand ideals or patriotism or duty, but the simple refusal to let down the men beside us, the bond between soldiers that was stronger than fear or exhaustion, or even the survival instinct. Christmas Day 1944 dawned clear and cold, and that clear weather saved us. For the first time in days, the clouds lifted and Allied aircraft could fly. We heard them before we saw them, the sound of engines overhead, and then we saw the most beautiful sight of my life. C-47 transport planes dropping supplies by parachute. Hundreds of parachutes filled the sky, carrying ammunition and food and medical supplies, everything we desperately needed. Some of the drops landed in German territory and we couldn't recover them, but enough landed inside our perimeter to keep us fighting. We had ammunition again, we had food again, we had hope again. The siege wasn't over, but we now had the means to continue fighting, and that made all the difference. The resupply was accompanied by fighter bombers that attacked German positions, strafed their tanks and vehicles, gave them a taste of what we'd been enduring. The psychological impact of the air support was enormous, showed the Germans that we weren't alone anymore, that the full weight of Allied air power could now be brought to bear. The attacks slackened slightly after Christmas, the Germans having to deal with air attacks as well as our ground resistance, giving us a brief respite to redistribute supplies and treat the wounded and bury some of the dead. But the Germans weren't done. They continued attacking, continued trying to break through, throwing everything they had at our positions. December 26th brought another massive assault on our sector, tanks and infantry supported by artillery, a desperate push to break through before the relief column everyone knew was coming could reach us. We fought them off again, using the resupplied ammunition, calling in airstrikes on German concentrations, holding the line through another day of brutal combat. But we were at the absolute end of our strength, running on fumes, barely able to function. If the relief didn't come soon, we'd break not from enemy action but from simple physical collapse. The relief came on December 26th in the afternoon. Patton's Third Army breaking through from the south, tanks and infantry smashing through the German encirclement, opening a corridor to Bastogne. We heard the sound of the tanks before we saw them, the distinctive rumble of American armor, and men started crying with relief, hardened paratroopers breaking down because the ordeal was finally over. The tanks rolled into Bastogne, the siege was lifted, we'd held. We'd done what everyone said was impossible, held against overwhelming odds, survived when survival seemed unlikely, refused to break when breaking would have been understandable. The cost had been terrible. The 101st Airborne Division suffered over 2,000 casualties during the Siege of Bastogne, killed and wounded and missing. My regiment lost nearly half its strength. My company was down to about 30 men from the 100 we'd started with. We'd fought for 8 days in conditions that should have destroyed us against an enemy that should have overwhelmed us. And we'd held. But the victory felt hollow. Felt like we'd just survived rather than won. Because so many hadn't survived because the price had been so high. I was evacuated on December 27th, suffering from severe frostbite on my feet and hands, from malnutrition and exhaustion and exposure. They sent me to a hospital in France, and I spent 6 weeks recovering, losing 3 toes to frostbite, regaining the weight I'd lost, trying to process what I'd experienced. The physical wounds healed mostly, but the psychological wounds never did. Bastogne marked me permanently, changed how I understood human endurance and sacrifice, showed me what people are capable of when pushed beyond any reasonable limit. We'd held because there was no choice, because surrender or retreat meant death or capture, because the men beside us were holding and we couldn't let them down. That's all it was. Simple animal stubbornness and refusal to quit, dressed up afterward in language about heroism and duty and strategic importance. The Siege of Bastogne became legendary, was celebrated as one of the great defensive stands in American military history. We were called heroes, received commendations and medals, were praised for our determination and courage. And we deserved that recognition. We really did hold against impossible odds, really did accomplish something remarkable, but the legend obscures the reality, the suffering and fear and desperation, the cold and hunger and exhaustion, the feeling of abandonment when we were surrounded, the terror that we'd all die in that frozen town for no good reason. The legend is clean and heroic, but the reality was muddy and painful and traumatic in ways that never fully healed. I went back to combat in February 1945, fought through Germany until the end of the war, but nothing compared to Bastogne, to those 8 days when we held against everything the Germans could throw at us. Every subsequent battle was easier by comparison, not because it was actually easier, but because I'd already survived the worst, already proved I could endure the impossible. Bastogne became my reference point, the experience against which everything else was measured. Hard day? Not as hard as Bastogne. Cold night? Not as cold as Bastogne. Scared? Not as scared as I was at Bastogne. The siege defined me, became the central experience of my war, and probably of my life. I came home in 1945, married my high school sweetheart Maria, raised 4 children, worked as a school teacher for 35 years. I built a good life, a normal life, exactly what I dreamed about during those frozen nights in Belgium. But Bastogne never left me, remained a presence in my thoughts, a memory that surfaced during cold weather or times of stress or quiet moments when my mind wandered. I couldn't explain to Maria or my children what it had been like, couldn't find words adequate to describe the cold and hunger and fear, couldn't make them understand how close we'd come to breaking, how near the edge we'd operated for 8 endless days, so I mostly stayed silent, carried the memories privately, and let them know me through my nightmares rather than my words. I attended 101st Airborne reunions for decades, gathered with other veterans of Bastogne, the only people who really understood what we'd experienced. We'd share stories, remember friends who didn't make it, support each other in ways civilians couldn't. There was a bond between Bastogne veterans that transcended normal friendship, a connection forged in shared suffering, a mutual understanding of what it means to endure the unendurable. When fellow Bastogne veteran died, it felt like losing family, like another piece of that shared experience was disappearing. Now most of them are gone, and I'm one of the few survivors left, one of the last living witnesses to the siege. I'm 97 years old now, and Bastogne feels both distant and immediate, 80 years ago but also yesterday. The physical scars have faded. My frostbite damage is just chronic pain now rather than acute injury, and my body has carried me much further than I expected after those 8 days of abuse. But the psychological scars remain fresh. The memories as vivid as if they happened last week. I can still feel the cold, still taste the hunger, still hear the sound of German tanks and the screams of wounded men, still see Eddie Thompson dying slowly because we couldn't help him. Those memories are part of me, woven into my identity, defining aspects of who I became. Looking back, I'm proud we held Bastogne, proud we accomplished something that military historians still study and celebrate. We made a difference. Our stand helped blunt the German offensive, helped turn the tide of the Battle of the Bulge, contributed to final Allied victory. That matters, should be remembered and honored. But I'm also aware of the cost, of the men who died there, of the survivors who were marked forever, of the years of life lost and the trauma that echoed through decades. Heroism and suffering aren't mutually exclusive, both can be true simultaneously. And Bastogne was both triumph and tragedy, victory and nightmare combined. If I could go back and change anything, would I? Would I wish we'd surrendered, been taken prisoner, avoided the suffering? I don't think so, despite everything. We did what needed to be done, held a position that mattered strategically, proved that Americans could stand against the best the Germans could offer, but I wish the cost had been lower. Wish Eddie and all the others had survived. Wish we'd had proper winter clothing and adequate supplies and not been forced to endure conditions that no humans should have to endure. I wish war was something other than what it is, but wishing doesn't change reality. The Siege of Bastogne taught me that humans can endure almost anything when they have no choice, that the body and spirit can survive conditions that seem impossible, that bonds between people facing shared danger are stronger than any other human connection. It taught me that heroism and suffering are inseparable, that great victories require great sacrifices, that the glory is always purchased with blood and pain, and it taught me that the men who survive carry the weight of those who don't, that living through an ordeal like Bastogne means spending the rest of your life wondering why you survived when better men died, carrying guilt and grief and memories that never fade. I tell this story now because soon I'll be gone, and with me will go the lived memory of those 8 days, the first-hand knowledge of what it was really like to be surrounded in Bastogne in December 1944. The history books will remain, the official accounts and statistics and strategic analyses, but they can't capture the reality, the cold that penetrated to your bones, the hunger that consumed your thoughts, the exhaustion that made thinking nearly impossible, the fear that never went away, the bonds that sustained us, the desperation of holding when holding seemed impossible. Only those who were there can understand. And soon we'll all be gone, and Bastogne will become just another historical event rather than a living memory. If this story moved you, if it helped you understand what soldiers endured during the Siege of Bastogne and the Battle of the Bulge, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to hear more stories from World War II veterans. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember the men who held Bastogne in December 1944, who endured the impossible, who refused to surrender despite overwhelming odds. Remember that victory always has a cost, and that the cost is carried by real people with names and families and dreams that were shattered or deferred. Thank you for listening to this old paratrooper's memories of 8 days that felt like forever. Airborne, all the way.